which of course disease is.
Okay. What treatments were available to the early settlers?
Oh, now for the early settlers, that was a real riot. American medicine was way behind Europe and way behind the Muslim world, which was far in advance of the United States. Things like some diseases, you would treat them by breaking the neck of a chicken and burying it under a full moon. One treatment for many ailments was mercury, but mercury is actually a deadly poison that can drive you crazy and can destroy your liver. There was a lot of quack medicine that was taken by the general medical community as sound. For example, when people were dying of yellow fever and malaria in New Orleans, they would fire cannons into the swamp to break up the, quote, foul air, unquote, that was causing the disease. And of course, we now know when they're doing that, that the only way they would have helped is if the cannonball happened to kill some mosquitoes or something along the way. But it was worse than that, because in the American medical system, people who had good ideas were often discounted because of who they were, not the quality of their ideas. Milk sickness, which killed Abraham Lincoln's mother, it had been figured out by a woman healer in North Carolina, and this received national publicity, but nobody would listen to her because she was a woman. She wasn't a professionally trained doctor. Similarly, it was an Alabamian, Dr. William Gorgas, who figured out that, Dr. Gorgas had some ideas from a Mississippi doctor, and his Mississippi doctor had figured out that mosquitoes had something to do with malaria and yellow fever. But nobody would listen to him because he's a rural doctor from Mississippi. What is he going to know? So anyway, Gorgas is helping to build the Panama Canal. Our Jamaican workers are dying right and left from yellow fever and malaria. He decides to give the Mississippi doctor's theory a chance and wages war on the mosquitoes. His workers stop dying, the Panama Canal was built, and becomes one of the great engineering achievements of all time. But it wouldn't have been possible without Dr. William Gorgas of Alabama.
Are there certain diseases that are tied to specific ethnicities?
Yes, malaria and yellow fever are tied to Africa, and of course the people who live in Africa, to dengue fever. Africa is a great center for disease, even though Africa is not the great center for jungles, oddly enough. Disease does not seem to have developed like it did in Africa. It did not seem to develop the same way in Indonesia or in South America, but in Africa. And so African people are profoundly affected by disease. Sickle cell anemia, which is considered to be a genetic defect in African American people, that actually was created by evolution as a defense against malaria. And so there are certain diseases that affect different people. Eskimos, for example, are severely affected by almost all diseases because they live in an environment that's largely disease-free. So they don't have the same immunities that, say, someone from Africa would have. Ironically, in South America, the people of South America, they live in a jungle that is a greater jungle than Africa ever had, yet they did not have the same immunities to diseases. There used to be civilizations with millions of people who lived in the Amazon Valley, but then Europeans and Africans come with their diseases. These spread through there. Now they have yellow fever and malaria. When I was your age, 10 times as many people, native people, lived in the Amazon who live there now, and they have died. They've died because they were exposed to chicken pox. They were exposed to measles, to influenza, Legionnaire's disease. The list goes on and on. And they're devastated because they do not have the same immunities Europeans do. Now, Native Americans had an immunity to syphilis. We still do not understand how that worked. But the Native Americans gave syphilis to the Europeans, and as a consequence, thousands and thousands of Europeans died of syphilis, and syphilis becomes this huge history-changing disease. But like I said, the Native Americans originally had some kind of defense against syphilis, and so they were able to give it to the Europeans, and the Europeans had no defense for it.
Okay, the first question was about health care in the 1500s. people in the 1500s still believed in a theory of the four humors, bodily humors. And this had been around since ancient time, like ancient Greece, that there was, see if I can remember them, yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And that any illness was caused by an imbalance of those humors. So that's one thing about healthcare in the 1500s. You asked me about divisions of healthcare. Not really. I've read before that if you were a barber, you could also be a surgeon or a doctor because you had, razors and cutting tools. I do know in the colonial time, the idea of a midwife came about. And our textbook tells us that a lot of times doctors were kind of resentful of the midwives and didn't want them to be allowed to practice. You asked me if the medical profession was highly respected. No, not at that time because, and we'll get to this on a later question, there was no standardization of training. I know I read one time, and we'll explain bleeding and purging. They said about the doctor, he came, he bled, he purged, he didn't help. A lot of times people would rather try to deal with their own issues, maybe with like home and herbal remedies, because sometimes the doctor made things worse. You asked if there were any religious restrictions. The thing that came to my mind were the Calvinists. In U.S. History 1, we talk about the Calvinists, how they were very strict on everything was the hand of God. And when someone came up with the idea of inoculation against smallpox which of course you're putting a little bit of the vaccine in to keep you from getting full-blown smallpox, some of the Calvinists, and this would be in the colonial period, were against that because they felt that's trying to play God. They felt like if God wants you to get smallpox, you shouldn't be trying to stop him. So that's what came to mind when you ask about religious restrictions. You ask about